Let's go ahead and get started.
Okay.
First things first, could you just introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background and where you're at currently?
Okay. Well, my name is Chuck Anderson. I'm professor in the computer science department at Colorado State University, where I've been for, 33 years now. Um, it's in Fort Collins, Colorado. I started off my academic work in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm from Nebraska and went to University of Nebraska as an undergraduate in computer science. Uh, Mostly because I was interested in all the sciences in high school. I couldn't decide which one to focus on, so I thought, well, these at the time these new things called computers were going to be useful in probably all the sciences. So I'll just study those for a while and then decide what science to into later. And about that time, well, before that a little bit, but computer science did become a discipline on its own. So I studied that as an undergraduate and was really fascinated by it. And let's see if I not spend too much time on this. And when I graduated from the University of Nebraska, I looked around for graduate schools that might help me um, pursue my interest in computer science and in machine learning, because as an undergraduate, we didn't have machine learning courses, but I did run across a book in the library on evolutionary computing that really fascinated me. Um, Anyway, so at that point, I guess I knew I wanted to study the brain. I'm not even really sure where it came from. I've been reading some paperback books at the time, one by Norbert Wiener on cybernetics and others on different theories of the brain. Nothing very scientific. But I shopped around looking for graduate programs, and I ran across one at the University of Massachusetts. They had a program developed by Michael Arby, but they called it brain theory, which was really wild to me at the time. It still is pretty wild that somebody in computer science had a brain theory program. So I applied there and went there. And while there, I found Andy Bartow was a new faculty member there with a research program going on, and he was looking for graduate students to hire. And I thought he was doing reinforcement learning, the foundation of reinforcement learning at the time. And I was lucky enough to land a position with him, and he really inspired me to consider how the brain learns. Um, and so I took some neurophysiology courses as a grad student. It was all new to me, but it was watered down enough that I could follow some of it. And that meshed really well with what the research group Andy Bartow headed was doing. He was working with a person in the Air Force, a civilian in the Air Force that was funding various groups. His name was Harry Klopf, and he wrote a book called The Hedonistic Neuron, how neurons are like single cell organisms that are self-interested, trying to get as much dopamine as they can, is a simple way to describe it. So that fascinated me, the connection between computer science and algorithms and how the brain might learn. So I went through the graduate program there for my PhD, and then after that, I worked for a few years at GT Laboratories in a small machine learning group. And after that, I came out here to Colorado State University looking for a nice place where we could raise our family, and um, wasn't hugely competitive for getting tenure. I wanted to have a life in addition to academic stuff. So that's where I landed, and I can talk a lot more about my adventure here. But I think I should stop and let you ask me another question.
Sure. Well, that's awesome. Just to sort of walk it back a little, I guess,
Sure.
did you feel like going from computer science to neuroscience that maybe the way that computer scientists think about how the brain works, or even the way that you came to understand how, the brain functions had parallels to computer science? I feel like it's or talking about neural networks and sort of the more
Hmm.
like cognitive psychology aspects of neuroscience, a lot of people use similar terms like algorithms and schemas and things like that.
Hmm.
As an actual computer science, how did that feel kind of taking in that new information?
Yeah. Well, to begin with, for me, I was fascinated by learning how what we understood about how neurons work and the processes, and how I might be able to use computers to simulate that and explore the limits of those ideas. So it was more, computers were more of a tool to help understand the what we know about the brain, how to model that. But the more I got into it, the more I realized, well, um, there's theories out there that show these simple ideas of neurons can probably do arbitrary computations. And so I realized there really is a connection there. What we use, how we use computers, how we program them, or how we design the algorithms could be very much related to how the brain might work. So computer science was more of a test bed or a way to kind of test these various theories about how brains work to see what they can develop. Um, yeah, let's see. Computers were also very useful in understanding brain signals. So that was another strong connection I ran into when I first came to Colorado. There was a person, the chair of the electrical engineering department here, had just come from Purdue, I think it was, and he was one of the first people to start working in brain-computer interfaces. So ways of interpreting EEG, signals that you record from the scalp. And kind of a funny story. He was trying to get some National Science Foundation funding to pursue that work at Colorado State University, but his proposals were being rejected. When I arrived, he saw that I had done neural networks in computer science, and he said, I know if we write a proposal together with neural networks in the title, we'll get funded. And we did. And so that's how I really got my start there. So that was yet another connection between brain and computers.
Yeah, that brings up a question. I guess as a computer science researcher, did you either back when you were doing your PhD or even now feel like it's difficult to get grants or to really communicate the type of research that you're interested in pursuing to funding organizations?
Yeah, that is interesting. I've been in this a lot of years, and I've seen a lot of shifts and changes in funding agency interests. And back then in the early 1990s, when I came here, neural networks were becoming, um, what's the right word? Becoming more interesting to funding agencies. For a while, people said there was no work in neural networks, but there was. It was more symbolic AI that was getting the funding, rules, and everything else. But we were still doing work on neural networks, and so it was fairly straightforward to get grants at the time to do neural networks, especially if there was a connection to brains and neuroscience. And I think that's still true. There's still so many, I guess I'm jumping ahead now. The deep learning community is changing so rapidly that the techniques that are being developed have wide applicability to study of neuroscience. And so I think it's still fairly easy to get those kinds of grants. It's hard to get just straight machine learning grants because everybody's doing it.
Yeah.
Um,
So
but
it's
to
a
have
bit
real,
easier when you're using machine learning or AI or deep learning and applying
yeah,
it to another scientific discipline, more so than just pure computer science.
right. Agencies like NSF really are keen on interdisciplinary work, and so that's what I love, and so that's worked out well for me. Yeah.
And you mentioned you worked in industry for a while. Was that something like were you recruited into industry? Was that something that you were interested in doing? Like what brought you out of academia towards that?
Right. Um, I was interested that the main draw for me was that fellow graduate student that we were was Rich Sutton. He and I were the first two students of Andy Bartos at the time, and Rich graduated before I did and went to GTE Laboratories, which was close to University of Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. And he joined there because it was a small new group of AI researchers. I think we were a total of 8 people that were charged with doing basic research and free to publish as much as we wanted to, as long as we had some kind of applications related to GTE industries. So I really followed him there. I thought, this would be probably a better paying job than academia right away, and I wanted to publish a few things for my dissertation. So I thought that would be a good chance to do that. And it was. It was a super place to work for a while. We did some fun work with machine learning on fluorescent tube manufacturing lines, including some reinforcement learning. And it was almost set to be fielded or deployed in their Sylvania plants, and then GT sold Sylvania, so we didn't get to see see that work. But just about at the same time that happened, this group that I was in started swinging back towards more applied work, and we weren't quite as free to pursue our own interests. And also, this stint in industry with my family was always, we kind of agreed that it would be a temporary thing because academia was much more flexible and be a great job to have if we start raising kids and things like that. So after 4 years, I did finally get back to searching for an academia position, but it was mainly to have the freedom of time and topic to move back to academia.
And can you talk a little more about what your time or like what a day in the life is structured like in academia versus in industry?
Okay. Um, well, in industry, like I said, it was kind of a unique situation. We were very much a basic research group, so we would just talk out ideas on new machine learning methods to try, and we didn't have much direction during the day, but we would spend part of each day working on some of the applications to show the supervisors in the company. So it was sort of researching what was currently being done, like in making flat fluorescent tubes, um, and then designing ways of using machine learning to improve the control of those manufacturing lines. Um, and then towards the deadline from when we'd have to have something to show, we'd have to spend a lot of time on a demonstration of what these methods could do in a simulation. So a lot of time was spent on that. And we did write some papers too together to publish out in the standard journals on what that work was. Academia, though, was quite different because there's three things involved. There's teaching, research, and service. Um, and the department I joined was a well-balanced department. They valued teaching and research just about equally at the time. So a lot of my time initially was spent on designing the curriculum for the classes I was teaching, and would stay up maybe overnight finishing an assignment that I was going to give the next day to make sure it would work, things like that. So it's all kind of brand new to me. But the nice or a nice difference for me in academia versus industry was the wide variety of people that I could communicate with. In the university, there's all kinds of sciences. Like I said, I liked all the sciences, and everybody has interesting data. And that collaboration was amazing. I didn't have that in industry.
Mm.
So day in the life there is, I don't know, two or so days at least of the week, maybe 3 days of the week are spent teaching and preparing lessons or curriculum and grading. 2 to 3 days a week is on the research, writing proposals. There's lots of proposal writing because you have to bring money in to get tenure and need to publish the papers and advise students. So there's just the requirements are much more diverse in academia, but the hours are more open. In industry, you had to punch in at a certain time and leave at a certain time, record your hours you spent on each project. At some point, they told us we had to fill out our time cards down to the hundredth of an hour until one of the senior scientists said, okay, I'm going to fill in all the hours that I'm thinking at night too about this. And the company backed off on that. We just had to fill out to the nearest hour. So there's
Yeah,
pressures like that.
right. I imagine it's hard as someone who works primarily in knowledge work to have that balance where you're just working, 9 to 5, and then you're expected to go home afterwards and not keep thinking about your projects and not be
Right.
kind of tinkering around all the time. Um,
It's it's hard to shut the brain off when you're terribly curious about something, anything.
for sure. Um, Great. I mean, this is such an interesting perspective since, I mean, a lot of people who get a PhD kind of assume that their only option is to continue in academia. And I've heard a lot of, people are stressed and kind of, anxious about the lack of, spots and kind of
Mhm.
perceived hurdles in the path of getting to like a tenure position. And I think industry can be a little off-putting for certain types of people. So it's really, I mean, it sounds like you're really at home in academia and it's what you love to do, but it's really cool to hear what that lifestyle is like as a person who has a PhD.
Yeah, and it has changed a lot over the years too. My students graduating with PhD in computer science are somewhat struggling to find machine learning positions because a lot of the companies bought them up, in the last 5 or 6 years, and now they're starting to let them go. So there's a lot of stress there, and some are looking for postdocs even in machine learning. So yeah.
Yeah. And I'm curious what you've heard your students say, or even your, undergraduate students or PhD students that you mentor, like what it's been like for them kind of navigating a career in computer science. I feel like in the past, like couple years especially, there's a lot of kind of discussion about how AI can replace human work, but also how so many people kind of invested in learning computer science that the field is a little oversaturated now,
Mhm.
which has left a lot of like recent graduates without a lot of career prospects. So curious to see like what people, especially people working in sort of deep learning, reinforcement learning, your research areas are experiencing as they try to move on.
Mhm. Um, well, I'm hearing from them and from people at companies looking for folks that they want to hire students who have the experience in machine learning and deep learning and reinforcement learning, but have more than just that, have experience maybe developing applications using AI in various fields. Um, they're looking for people with a breadth of experience, not just pure machine learning anymore. And I think that's because companies really do need that. They need people that can communicate across disciplines and deal with that. So one of my most recent PhD students did some work with me in atmospheric sciences and climate modeling, and he's getting some offers from several companies that are in that area and they want to hire, like you said, AI is everywhere, and a lot of companies who are in application areas are still thirsty for deep learning researchers in their area. So
Yeah.
that really
I feel like
helps.
that's a huge topic right now, just being able to actually apply machine learning or AI to specific things versus just having the skill set to program.
Right. And that what goes in that skill set is critical. A lot of students go through programs and just learn how to download the packages and apply them and not really know how to what's underlying them and how to modify those methods a little bit for an application. Sometimes it's hard to shoehorn an application into those packages. So that's critical too.
Mhm. Um, and I mean, when your students have these issues, or you're hearing people say, like, we want to hire people who have experience and who've done X, Y, and Z, what do you do as a mentor slash professor to kind of help students get on the right path?
Well, I guess there's two things that have worked well. Like if I have funding in a certain area that is cross-disciplinary, like this climate modeling work, then I kind of like to funnel my some of my best students into that area to help with the breakthroughs, but to learn how to collaborate with experts in other domains, to have letters of recommendation from not just computer science, but from these other fields to show they do have this diverse background. So the funding really helps. What also helps, though, is to, at the beginning of an interaction with the students, to spend some time trying to understand where their curiosity is outside of just learning how to build these machine learning tools. What would they like to apply them to? Um, I had a student recently who started off with me analyzing EEG signals because that was available and handy. But at some point he said, I'm kind of running out of steam on this. I'm and our funding had actually disappeared from that project at the time. He said, I'm really interested in music. So is there a way I can apply deep learning to music? And he's close to finishing his dissertation, but he's developing methods to separate instruments from audio recordings, which is called stemming, finding the stems of the piece. And he's really excited. So having enthusiasm to carry through your research, and then that enthusiasm that you have will carry you a long ways in your interviews, I think. So that's really important.
That's really cool. Do you feel like going kind of into that interview aspect, do you feel like in cases where students kind of want to change courses or have been doing a certain type of work because, it was what was available and they
Mhm.
want to do something else, like how far does that enthusiasm really take them versus technical skills? Like, where do you think that balance lies? And how can students communicate that they're not just, passionate and excited about something, but really willing to see it out as, a 4 to 6 year PhD, for example, and really stick with that?
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, if the student has been able to publish papers in the application area, not just in machine learning journals or conferences, that helps a lot. Um, Showing that they have enough interest to actually apply for and get internships in different areas, uh, that really goes a long ways in an interview, that you got the experience working in a company in that particular area. So my student interested in music has found a local startup company who's doing some music audio analysis. So he's talking to them maybe about getting an internship there. I'm not sure that's what you were asking about. Is that
No,
related to what you're getting?
yeah, I'm always curious about kind of what steps really stand out as, someone on the other side of an interview. Because I
Hmm.
hear a lot of students, like I'm traditionally, I was pre-med in undergrad and now I'm doing research. So I was around a lot of people who felt like they needed to be doing certain things with their time and were never really sure what would really help them stand out. Um, but I really think getting at that, having the passion, but also applying your passion and discipline to achieving, actual output is really good
Yeah.
advice.
And that passion will also help you maybe land a postdoc. There's some postdocs out there with people who have a lot of funding, even with some of the industry labs have postdocs they offer. I had a student who was doing reinforcement learning with me. He wasn't sure where to go, but he ended up with a postdoc that took him into studying reinforcement learning in neural tissue in Canada, which really fascinated him. And he ended up working at a medical school. So he didn't have that direction planned, but what got him excited in his postdoc really took him further in his career.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I mean, could you talk a little about what really excites you right now in research? Like, what are the people in your lab working on? What are some
Hmm.
things in the future that you're really interested in your fields?
Okay. Well, I'm trying to figure that out right now too, because I am heading for retirement probably in a year or two. And I'll carry on some of this work then. But there's, I guess, three areas that have really got me excited in the last few years. I've still been working on the brain-computer interface things. There's been a lot of hype about implanted electrodes in people's heads or animals' brains.
Mm.
Those are fascinating, but I personally don't think that's necessary to have practical applications. And I think we've been limited a lot by using conventional scalp electrodes that have been around for decades because the information you get is a combination of activity across a wide part of your cortex in order for the signal to be strong enough to get through your scalp and your skin and everything else. But recently, I spent a sabbatical leave with in Rhode Island with Walter Basio, he's a biomedical engineer and he's developed a new kind of scalp electrode that has three little concentric metal rings, and he records signals from all three and subtracts one from another. ends up getting a very precise precise recording of what's going on um, spatially and temporally. So he gets a much better indication of what's happening directly underneath an electrode rather than a wide area. And he can get higher frequencies. He's recording frequencies that people for a long time thought you couldn't record outside your head, like gamma frequencies above 80, 90 hertz. He's working on epilepsy, and he's finding signals that precede a seizure in people up to an hour before, and he's injecting very, very small currents using these electrodes. So he's breaking new ground there. But I worked with him to do brain-computer interface work and bought some of his electrodes, and I'm currently trying to, I think I've got some results now that show we can detect which finger you're moving or even imagining moving with his electrodes, whereas with conventional electrodes, we just can't detect that because part of your cortex that's related to that is a very small part of your motor strip.
Mhm.
So I think we could have maybe controlling a prosthetic hand even without implanting electrodes at all.
Yeah,
If we
wow,
can
that's really
avoid
cool.
that.
Having
Yeah, I think.
such high resolution to be able to even,
Mhm.
read electrical signals through the scalp from different areas in the brain is so cool.
Yeah, he has a company he calls CRE Medical. You can find that.com where his electrodes are, and he has some data there to show. So that's one area. um, The second area is reinforcement learning. I did that in graduate school, and I'm still very interested in it. It's people understand that it's slow because you have to have a lot of experiences to learn what actions are followed by rewards. That could be a lot of steps in the future, like playing a game. You just get a win or a loss at the end of the game. And recently, as I'm sure you know, DeepMind has shown we can train computers to play Go or chess. And I thought that was still decades away. So that was quite a breakthrough. But they require lots of recordings, lots of big computers to do that. So we've been looking at what can we learn uh, that's not really reinforcement related because we're constantly observing the world. And as a newborn or a young baby uh, lies on their back, you can see their hands flailing in front of their face and they see it and pay a lot of attention to it. And that brain of that little kiddo is learning how to correlate muscle signals to movements in the world. And just learning that will save a lot of time when you do face a goal-directed task. Like the, the kiddo sees a colorful toy they want to reach for it. They know how to do that all of a sudden. So there's a lot of learning that could go on. Some people call this self-supervised now before you actually do reinforcement learning. So we've done some work with that. Um, and we need new architectures in our neural networks to do that well. And one of those architectures I'm really excited about is referred to as a mixture of experts, which was first developed in the 90s by another fellow graduate student, but has been recently picked up by Jeff Hawkins. He wrote this book called A Thousand Brains that I really like. Oops, backward on my screen.
I can
But
see that.
he's got a company called Numenta, I think it is, and they're developing really interesting simulations of what our cortex may be doing based on a theory. Cut me off if I'm going too long, but
Oh no, you're
it's
fine.
based on a theory that Vernon Mountcastle came up with decades ago, based on circuitry that's been discovered, the wiring diagram of our cortex that's based on a bunch of very similarly structured columns of tissue. The cortex is very thin, but it goes kind of deep into not deep, but down into the cortex. And the cortex is made up of all these columns of similar wiring within the column and some communication between them. And Hawkins is developing simulations that rely on that kind of design where you have each column thinking of each column as sort of an expert on knowing how to decide what to do in different situations. And another part of your brain is deciding which one of those columns are experts to pay attention to. And so yeah,
And do
it's all
you
in.
think about like melding these different research areas together? Like, I mean, when you were
Mhm.
talking about reinforcement learning, like the first thing I thought of was using those really high resolution electrodes to be able to maybe like, put it on a baby as they're learning and kind of characterize what brain activity is happening as they become more familiar with the task or something like that.
Yes, yes. I think there's a long way to go there, and we've just started doing, not we, but the the community has just started doing that with implanted electrodes. But being able to put it on a child without invading their brain is would be really useful. And yeah, I agree with you. I think the strategy we follow as we learn different things must change as we learn, and that would help us understand the whole cognition across the brain if we could get a lot of those recordings. Yeah.
Yeah, I did my like senior neuroscience thesis on brain-brain synchrony. So how do brain electrical activity kind of sync up and change as two people who are in social contact kind of learn information. And I read a lot of really interesting papers about using like EEGs in classroom settings to kind of monitor what kind of temporal differences and like what the specific lag is between a teacher's brain activity as they're teaching information and like students' brain activity as they're picking it up, and whether or not there are kind of characteristic signal synchrony happening there that either like indicates or predicts learning. Um, so I
Wow, that's
just find that
fascinating.
so fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. There's, yeah, I'm convinced there's, and it sounds like you are too, there's interactions that happen between people that are somehow our brains become synchronized and maybe our mental imagery is similar if a person describes it well enough. And
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot to be learned there yet.
Yeah, and I feel like using AI and machine learning will definitely speed up the progress and kind of interpreting what those signals mean, especially as new technology is being invented. Because, I mean,
Yeah,
traditional EEGs are pretty noisy and kind of difficult to interpret, especially when it's not just a person in a room by themselves. And that's not a very naturalistic environment to, study interaction. So, I just think
you're
this
right.
is like such a
That's
cool cutting edge moment in this type of research.
Yeah, I think you've hit on the key idea there that these machine learning methods can tease apart the differences, different patterns in the signals when you're doing different mental tasks, and that provides hypotheses to the neuroscientists to try to verify in their work with brains. Um, we've had people doing, mental arithmetic or imagine the computer screen tumbling in 3 dimensions, trying to get some diversity in the EEG signals. And yeah, the neuroscientists at the time couldn't tell us what part of the brain we should record from, so we just recorded from a lot of them and used the machine learning methods to statistically find the differences. And that can be very revealing. Although one point early on, I was speaking at a conference and I said, well, the electrodes in the back of the head or the occipital area seem to relate to mathematical processing. And a well-known person in the audience stood up and said, I can tell you right now, math does not happen back there. I said, I'm not claiming it does, but there's something in those signals. And I had to admit, maybe this person was nervous doing math and there was some muscle activity from the neck that was being recorded there. But
Yeah.
we just don't know what we're going to find if we have enough data to explore with these deep learning models.
Yeah. And then the work of interpreting what that data is actually saying
Yeah,
is a whole nother layer. And
that's
really
key.
where that like cross-disciplinary partnership comes in, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Really cool.
Definitely.
All right, we're a little past half an hour, so I think we should end here. Thank you so much for your time again. This has been like such an awesome conversation. Um, and I mean, before we wrap up, do you have any closing thoughts or like words of encouragement to prospective students, other neuroscientists, anything you want
Um,
to share?
well, uh, I've enjoyed this a lot too. I really like talking with you and students, and what you're doing is going to be very helpful to you and anybody else who reads your results or listens to your recordings. And so I think the strongest advice to students is to talk to others as much as you can, even if they're in different disciplines, and find common interests or ways in which you can apply what you've learned to their areas. Even travel to other universities, or I guess we Zoom these days, right? And talk to people. If you're going to be traveling on vacation, just contact somebody in the department that maybe you might be interested in, say you'd like to just stop in and talk to them. That's kind of how I found the graduate school I wanted to go to. We traveled different places, and some had very interesting work, but the people I ran into just didn't seem to be interested or even care. But when I visited the University of Massachusetts, there was a faculty member there who I didn't end up working with, but he got in the middle of summer, he got up from his desk, came around and sat on his desk and talked to me and my wife for several hours, which just floored me. And I knew I wanted to go there. So like you say, the interpersonal stuff matters a lot too. So
Yeah, really having a good connection, I think, is so important when you're seeking out a research mentor.
hmm And there's so many different kinds of research mentors out there. So the more people you talk to, the more you'll know about what you want.
That
Yeah.
too. All right. Well, thank you so much.